I mean, right now, the whole culture right now is having a discussion of race, and particularly issues of institutional racism and are there such things as white privilege. A man in my church named Esau McCaulley, I don't know if you're familiar with
Oh
him.
yeah.
Yeah. Esau's recently published a book called Reading While Black, which I've been reading lately. I think it's a really good book, but as I was reading, I thought, oh man, I wish this book had been published before I had written my book, because I think that there are some issues of overlap between race and gender. But I've been very surprised at some of the responses to his book that I've seen, again, in the social media settings where he's accused of being, the word that is used is woke, defensive argument that, well, the church is not racist, the church doesn't discriminate. Well, maybe not consciously, but it's been true forever that Sunday morning is the most, one place that is still most segregated in American culture. And that is, again, true. You know, my seminary where I teach, we have a lot of African students. We don't have very many African American students. So you know, if you walk into my church, I mean, into my seminary, you find a black student and you talk to him or her, there's a much higher chance that they're from Kenya or Uganda than they are from downtown Pittsburgh, where the seminary is located. So I think all of these things are things that we need to be discussing and trying to do what we can about. But I think it's something that it's going to, I think, take generations before the church really has gotten past some of the cultural baggage that we've been holding on to.
And I recently read Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, where he talks about some of the trauma that the Bible has caused, specifically Paul's, right? Getting back to Paul, slaves, obey your masters, and propagating the idea that slavery is okay in the New Testament, and how harmful and hurtful that was to our Black community, especially during the early American church, as pastors were advocating that slavery was okay. That was being preached from the pulpit. Like, there's no wonder why, like, if I was Black, like, I would want to have nothing to do with the church. But then at the same time, the Bible was also used to support the liberation, and Martin Luther King relied on the Bible. And so you have, like, the Bible is such a complex book because you have these passages that are providing support, encouragement, comfort. At the same time, you have these passages that can be very harmful. And like you're saying, like, it relates to not only women, but also the racism that's in America with Paul advocating slavery.
I would push back against saying Paul advocating slavery. I don't think Paul was advocating slavery. One of the really helpful things I talk about in my book is a notion of what I call Christological subversion. What I call Christological subversion is a way that the Bible, New Testament, takes traditional notions that have been understood to be a certain way in the culture and kind of turns them upside down. So one of the things I talk about, again, relying on a particular man named David De Silva. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's a New Testament scholar. But he has written a lot about Mediterranean culture being an honor culture. And in an honor culture, there's always a hierarchy. Males are at the top, and various folks are lower down in the chain. Women are lower than men. Slaves are lowest of all. And one of the things that De Silva talks about in his book is the way that the New Testament subverts this honor culture. So the ways in which honor is established in Mediterranean culture are challenged. So the father in Mediterranean culture, and this includes both Jews and pagans, has absolute authority. But the notion of father in the New Testament is the father of Jesus. And this father is a father who does things like the father of the prodigal son, who runs out after the runaway, after the sinner, and brings them back. Jesus reaches out to people who are on the edges of society and culture, including, for example, the woman at the well who has been married 5 times, living with a man and not her husband. She becomes the first witness in the New Testament, the first evangelist in the New Testament. Paul, again, in Ephesians, really helpful here to read how he's actually challenging what are called the traditional ways in which people like Aristotle deal with the family, what are called the household codes, where Aristotle addresses commands to the husband only, and says, you're in charge, the wife is next, then are the children, then are the slaves, and your job is basically to tell all these people what to do. What Paul does in Ephesians is he addresses the people who normally would have been in positions of submission in a Mediterranean culture, and he actually gives them a place of dignity. So he says, he challenges both the male. So he says to the slave owner, you are a slave of Christ. He says to those who would be in traditional positions of submission that we're all to submit to one another, but they have a place of, he doesn't simply focus on top-down authority, but showing how there's a mutual relationship between everyone and that all are to follow in Christ. And then, of course, the crucial passage for Paul is Philemon, where he returns the slave Philemon to his master, and he says, I'm not exactly going to tell you what to do, but I would ask you to treat Philemon the same way you treat me. And the fact that that was preserved and was made canonical presumably means that the master freed Philemon. But it is a case, and again, I would point to this really helpful book by De Silva on honor culture, that the way the New Testament deals with things like slavery and honor in the contemporary culture is not simply to try to overthrow these things, because it wouldn't have happened, but to try to find ways to create more freedom and to challenge them from within. A couple of books I mentioned in my book that deal with these issues. A really helpful book by, the names are slipping me, Alan Paget. He has a really helpful book on authority in the New Testament called As Christ Submits to the Church. And then there's anyway, several books that I talk about, but one of the things that's been going on a lot in contemporary New Testament and Old Testament scholarship is showing how it is that the New Testament actually challenges New Testament culture, not New Testament culture, but Mediterranean culture, and gives a different vision. So, but that's also why hermeneutics is important. We can't simply put ourselves back in first century culture and say nothing has changed, and now we're going to pretend like we live in ancient Corinth or ancient Rome, and ignore the way in which, over the last 2,000 years, Christianity itself has contributed toward recognizing more and more freedom and equality. So one of the things I do argue about in my book, I have a chapter at the beginning where I talk about this shift that took place in terms of understanding what Christian freedom means, beginning from Luther and moving on. So when Luther talked about the freedom of a Christian, he was appalled at what was called the Peasants' Revolt. He said, no, you misunderstood. Justification by faith doesn't mean that serfs get to quit being serfs. But then a couple of generations later, you have John Wesley, who is arguing against slavery based on the same New Testament passages. He's drawing implications from Paul's understanding that Luther himself did not draw. And then, of course, in the 19th century, there were various Christians involved in the anti-slavery movement, people like William Wilberforce in Parliament, the anti-slavery movement, the abolitionists here in the United States. And then I think you certainly can make an argument, and has been made, should be made, that the civil rights movement in the 1960s was drawing on themes coming out of the scriptures. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the leaders of the civil rights movement were people like Martin Luther King Jr., various Roman Catholic clergy. So yeah, there have been people, and including people in the history of the church, who've argued for things like slavery based on a single passage in Paul here or there. But I think that's really a misreading of what's going on in the New Testament. Well, they're not fond of them, that's for certain.
Yeah.
But I think for the most part that I don't think that. Well, one needs to be careful here. I think among feminist theologians, the movement of feminist theology in the church since the 1980s have done research in this area and are familiar with this material. I think sometimes that has been unfortunate among certain kinds of feminist theologians, that they've simply presumed that the church is oppressive to women. But yeah, I mean, when women discover this, it doesn't make it certainly doesn't make them happy. It can sort of fulfill certain suspicions and stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I do think it's fortunate that is not the argument that's being used today, even among complementarians. But I do think that it needs to be pointed out that, okay, if that's not your argument, then you need a theological argument. more than just simply, well, men are in charge. Well, why should men be in charge if women are not somehow less intelligent than men? I think it also is the case, and this keeps coming out more and more, that whatever people say publicly, you do find out that behind closed doors, there's still a lot of sexism in the church and a lot of abuse in the church. There was a case a few weeks ago, or a couple of months ago, in a Facebook group run by some conservative Presbyterians. You may have heard about this. That a woman in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church had just written a book, not about women's ordination, but questioning some of the aspects of complementarianism. And apparently within this group that there was all kinds of sexist comments about women. They should be, the whole kind of barefoot pregnant kind of arguments. And Christianity Today ran an article about this a few months ago.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out this video clip from the Delgado Podcast. To get more videos like this, simply subscribe here on YouTube. You can also download the full episode of each show on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, or your favorite podcast player. Take care.